A black car screams down the narrow London street, tires screeching against wet pavement. Princess Anne steps off the curb, her mind elsewhere. The driver doesn't see her. She doesn't see the car. In 3 seconds, everything will change. One man sees it all unfolding. His heart stops. His legs move. He has no time to think, no time to plan, just seconds to decide, stay safe or risk everything for royalty. This is the story of the guard who became a hero, the princess who faced death, the split-second decision that shocked the world. The morning of March 15th started like any other Tuesday in London. The sky hung gray and heavy over the city, threatening rain but never quite delivering. James Morrison had been a Royal Protection Officer for 7 years, and he knew the routine by heart. Wake at 5, physical training at 6, briefing at 7:30, and on duty by 8:15 sharp. There was no room for mistakes in his line of work. Not when you were responsible for protecting members of the royal family. James stood at his usual position outside the entrance of the charity headquarters on Baker Street. Princess Anne was inside attending a morning meeting about rural healthcare initiatives, something she was deeply passionate about. He could see her through the glass doors, animated and engaged, speaking with doctors and community organizers. She had that way about her, he thought. Not like some royals who showed up for photos and left. She genuinely cared. The street was busier than usual. Morning commuters rushed past, clutching coffee cups and briefcases. A few tourists lingered nearby, hoping for a glimpse of royalty. James scanned the crowd constantly, his eyes moving from face to face, looking for anything out of place. A nervous gesture. A bulky jacket on a warm day. Someone too focused or not focused enough. His training had taught him to read people like books. Inside the building, the meeting was wrapping up. James touched his earpiece as his colleague Sarah's voice crackled through. The princess would be leaving in 5 minutes. He acknowledged the message and stepped closer to the curb, positioning himself for her exit. The protocol was simple. He would open the door, scan the immediate area, and guide her to the waiting car that would pull up within seconds of her appearance. But something felt different today. James couldn't put his finger on it. Maybe it was the unusual traffic. Cars were moving faster than normal, weaving between lanes as if everyone was running late. Or maybe it was the construction down the block, the orange cones and temporary barriers that had narrowed the street. Whatever it was, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered caution. The glass doors opened. Princess Anne emerged, still talking to one of the doctors. She was laughing at something, her face bright with genuine amusement. James stepped forward, his body automatically moving into protection mode. He glanced left and right, checking the traffic pattern. Their car was approaching from the south, about 30 seconds away. Princess Anne said her goodbyes and turned toward the street. She was still smiling, still thinking about the conversation she'd just had. She took a step toward the curb, then another. James moved with her, slightly to her right, his eyes sweeping the area. That's when he heard it. The sound of an engine revving too hard. Tires losing grip on asphalt. His head snapped to the left, and his blood turned to ice. A black sedan was racing down the street, moving at least 50 miles per hour in a 25 zone. The driver was looking down, his attention on something in his lap. A phone maybe, or a GPS. Not on the road. Not on the royal figure stepping into his path. Time seemed to stretch and compress all at once. James saw everything in perfect, terrible clarity. The car was 70 feet away, then 60. The princess was still moving forward, unaware, her mind on medical clinics and community outreach. 40 feet. The driver's head was still down. 30 feet. Other pedestrians were frozen, their mouths opening in horror, but no sound coming out yet. 20 feet, James didn't think. His body moved on pure instinct, fueled by 7 years of training and something deeper, something primal. He lunged forward, his arms reaching for Princess Anne, his shoulder connected with her side. And he wrapped both arms around her waist, driving forward with all his strength. They tumbled away from the curb together, James twisting his body mid-air to take the impact of the fall. They hit the pavement hard, rolling once, twice. The princess gasped, The air knocked from her lungs. James felt his elbow scrape against concrete, felt his shoulder take the brunt of their combined weight. The black sedan screamed past, missing them by inches. James felt the wind of its passage, smelled burning rubber and hot metal. The car's side mirror actually clipped his shoe, spinning it off his foot. The vehicle swerved wildly, the driver finally looking up, his face a mask of shock and horror. Brakes squealed. The car fishtailed, mounted the opposite curb, and crashed into a parked delivery van with a sickening crunch of metal. For a moment, everything was silent. Then the world rushed back in. People were screaming. Someone was shouting for help. Car alarms wailed. James lay on the ground, his arms still wrapped protectively around Princess Anne, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might break through his chest. The princess stirred beneath him. She was breathing, he realized with relief. She was alive. They were both alive. James carefully released her and pushed himself up onto his knees. His hands were shaking, he noticed distantly. Princess Anne sat up slowly, her hair disheveled, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. She looked at him with wide eyes, then turned to see the crashed car. Steam rising from its crumpled hood. Other security officers were rushing over now. Sarah reached them first, dropping to her knees beside the princess. Someone was calling for an ambulance. The crowd of onlookers had swelled, phones out, recording everything. Princess Anne turned back to James. She was breathing hard, her face pale but composed. When she spoke, her voice was steady, despite everything. She reached out and gripped his arm, her fingers surprisingly strong. James wanted to say something professional, something by the book. But all that came out was a breathless question, asking if she was all right. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, too high and tight. The princess nodded slowly. She was still holding his arm, still looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Gratitude, yes. But also something else. Recognition of what had just happened, of how close they'd come. Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. The driver of the black sedan had stumbled out of his car, looking dazed and horrified. He was young, James saw. Maybe 25. Just a kid who'd made a terrible mistake. Sarah was helping Princess Anne to her feet now, checking her for injuries with quick professional efficiency. James stood too, though his legs felt unsteady. His elbow was bleeding, he noticed. His jacket was torn. His shoe was lying in the middle of the street, its lace snapped. An ambulance pulled up, followed closely by 2 police cars. Paramedics rushed over with their equipment, insisting on checking both James and the princess, despite her protests that she was fine. James let them shine lights in his eyes and check his pulse, but he barely registered their presence. His mind was still replaying those terrible seconds. The sound of the engine, the driver's downturned head, the princess stepping forward, unaware, the desperate lunge. One of the paramedics was asking him questions. Did he hit his head? Was he dizzy? Any chest pain? James answered automatically, his eyes drifting back to Princess Anne. She was arguing with the other paramedic, insisting she didn't need to go to the hospital. She had meetings scheduled. People were depending on her. That was so like her, James thought. Even after nearly being killed, she was thinking about her duties, her responsibilities. It was one of the things he admired most about her. She took her role seriously. She showed up. She did the work. A senior police officer was interviewing the driver now, who was crying and trying to explain. He'd been using his GPS. He'd only looked down for a second. He hadn't seen her. He was so sorry. So terribly sorry. James felt an unexpected wave of sympathy for the young man. It was an accident. A stupid, careless mistake that could have ended in tragedy. But it was still an accident. The driver would have to live with what almost happened for the rest of his life. The area was being secured now. Yellow police tape going up. Officers directing traffic around the crash site. Someone had found James's shoe and brought it to him. The lace was indeed snapped, but the shoe was otherwise undamaged. He held it in his hand, staring at it. This small piece of evidence of how close disaster had come. A black car pulled up. The official vehicle that was supposed to have collected Princess Anne 20 minutes ago. The driver got out, his face creased with concern. The princess's private secretary emerged from the charity building, phone pressed to her ear, already managing the situation, already controlling the narrative that would inevitably spread. Princess Anne finally convinced the paramedics she was fine. She had a scrape on her knee and what would probably be a spectacular bruise on her hip, but nothing serious. She was lucky, they told her. Incredibly lucky. She glanced at James when they said it, and he saw in her eyes that she knew luck had nothing to do with it. The immediate chaos began to settle into organized activity. Police officers took statements from witnesses, each person eager to share what they'd seen. Though James noticed their accounts varied wildly. Some swore the car was going 70 miles per hour. Others said the princess had actually stepped directly into traffic. Human memory was unreliable, especially in moments of crisis. James had learned that early in his training. Sarah approached him with a bottle of water and a first aid kit. She was one of the best officers on the Royal Protection Team, calm under pressure and sharp as a knife. They'd worked together for 4 years, and he trusted her completely. She gestured for him to sit on a nearby bench and began cleaning the scrape on his elbow without asking permission. She worked in silence for a moment, then spoke quietly so only he could hear. Her words were simple but carried weight. She told him what he'd done was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, and she hadn't decided which yet, but she was glad he'd done it. James managed a weak smile. He told her he hadn't really thought about it. There was no time to think. He just moved. Sarah nodded as she applied antiseptic. She said that was what made him good at his job. The ability to act without hesitation. Some people froze in emergencies. Others ran away. Very few ran toward danger. She finished bandaging his elbow and closed the first aid kit with a snap. Across the street, Princess Anne was in deep conversation with her private secretary. Even from a distance, James could see her frustration. She kept gesturing toward the charity building, clearly wanting to return to her work, but her secretary was shaking her head firmly. Protocol dictated she return to the palace immediately after a security incident. There would be medical examinations, official reports, discussions with the royal family. The princess didn't like being treated as fragile. James knew this about her. She'd once continued an entire official visit to a mining community with a broken wrist, refusing to cancel despite the pain. She believed in showing up and not letting people down. It was admirable, but it also made his job harder sometimes, eh? Senior officer from the Metropolitan Police approached James. Commander Phillips was a man in his 50s with silver hair and a permanently stern expression. He'd been in law enforcement for 3 decades and had seen everything. He asked James to walk him through exactly what had happened. Starting from the moment Princess Anne exited the building, James recounted the sequence of events, keeping his voice steady and professional. He described hearing the engine, seeing the car, calculating the distance and speed, making the decision to act. Commander Phillips listened without interrupting, sharp eyes studying James's face. When James finished, the commander was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something James didn't expect. He said that in 30 years of police work, he'd seen many brave acts, but what James did today was remarkable. The split-second assessment, the physical courage, the willingness to put himself in harm's way. Most people would have frozen. Most trained officers would have frozen. James didn't know what to say to that. He mumbled something about just doing his job. Commander Phillips shook his head. He said it was more than that. Then he told James that there would be an inquiry, of course. Standard procedure after any incident involving a royal family member. James would need to file a detailed report. There would be interviews. But the commander wanted him to know that from what he'd seen and heard so far, James had acted properly and heroically. The commander walked away to speak with other officers, leaving James alone with his thoughts. An inquiry. Of course, there would be an inquiry. He'd physically grabbed and tackled a member of the royal family, even if it was to save her life. Every detail would be examined. His actions would be analyzed frame by frame from the dozens of phone videos that were probably already spreading across. Social media. James felt suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had been flooding his system was draining away, leaving him shaky and tired. He looked down at his hands. They'd finally stopped trembling. A well-dressed woman in her 40s approached him. She introduced herself as Victoria Hartley, Princess Anne's private secretary. She had the crisp efficiency of someone who managed royal schedules and handled crises with equal competence. She thanked James for his quick action, then informed him that Princess Anne wished to speak with him before leaving. James stood immediately, straightening his torn jacket as best he could. He followed Victoria across the street to where the princess waited by the official car. Other security personnel stood at a discreet distance, giving them privacy but remaining alert up close. James could see that Princess Anne looked more shaken than she'd appeared from afar. There was a tightness around her eyes, a pallor beneath her composed expression, but her voice was steady when she spoke. She thanked him truly and sincerely for what he'd done. She said she owed him her life, and those weren't words she used lightly. James felt his face grow warm. He replied that he was just doing his duty. Any officer would have done the same. The princess shook her head slightly. She said not everyone would have reacted so quickly. Not everyone would have put themselves at risk like that. She paused, then added that she wanted to make sure he received proper recognition for his actions. James felt uncomfortable with the idea. He told her respectfully that he didn't need recognition. He was glad she was safe. That was enough. Princess Anne studied him for a moment, and he saw a flicker of respect in her eyes. She said that whether he wanted it or not, what happened today would become public. The videos would spread. The story would be told. But she wanted him to know that she would personally ensure the narrative was accurate, and that he received the credit he deserved. Before James could respond, Victoria gently touched the princess's arm, indicating it was time to leave. Princess Anne nodded, then did something unexpected. She reached out and shook James's hand, her grip firm and warm. She held his gaze for a moment longer, and in that look was everything she couldn't say in front of others. The fear she'd felt, the gratitude, the recognition of the bond that now existed between them. Forged in those terrible seconds when death had come calling, then she was gone, sliding into the back seat of the official car. Victoria followed, and within moments the vehicle pulled away, flanked by police motorcycles. James watched until it disappeared around the corner. Sarah appeared at his elbow again. She told him they needed to get him back to headquarters. There would be paperwork to complete, medical examinations to undergo, and debriefings with senior officers. The day was far from over. James nodded and followed her to their vehicle. As they drove through London's streets, he stared out the window without really seeing the passing buildings and crowds. His mind kept returning to those few seconds. The sound of the engine, the princess stepping forward, the desperate lunge. Over and over, like a film loop, he couldn't stop. What if he'd been looking the other way? What if he'd hesitated for even 1 second? What if his angle had been wrong, and he'd missed her? What if the car had been faster, closer? The variations haunted him. So many ways it could have gone wrong. So many ways he could have failed. Sarah must have sensed his thoughts because she spoke quietly from the driver's seat. She told him to stop second-guessing himself. He'd done everything right. The princess was alive because of him. That was all that mattered. James knew she was right. But the what-ifs lingered anyway. They arrived at the Royal Protection Headquarters, a nondescript building in central London that housed the command center for all royal security operations. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. News of the incident had spread quickly, and officers who'd been on other assignments were gathered around monitors. Watching footage from various angles, James was immediately taken to the medical unit. A doctor examined him thoroughly, checking for signs of concussion, testing his reflexes, x-raying his shoulder. Despite the dramatic fall, he'd escaped with only minor injuries. Scraped elbow, bruised ribs, strained shoulder muscle. Nothing serious. The doctor cleared him for duty but recommended he take the rest of the day off. Next came the debriefing. James sat in a small conference room with 3 senior officers and recounted the incident for what felt like the 100th time. They asked detailed questions about his positioning, his sight lines, his decision-making process. They wanted to know exactly when he'd first perceived the threat, how he'd calculated the trajectory. What had gone through his mind in those critical seconds? James answered as precisely as he could. Though some details were already becoming fuzzy, That was normal after a traumatic event. The brain edited memories, filling in gaps, smoothing over rough edges. He did his best to separate what he actually remembered from what he'd seen in the videos that were now playing on every news channel. The officers seemed satisfied with his responses. One of them, Deputy Commander Walsh, told James he should be proud. His actions reflected well, not just on himself, but on the entire Royal Protection Unit. The training had worked exactly as designed. Threat identified, assessment made, action taken. Textbook response. Except it hadn't felt textbook in the moment. It had felt terrifying and chaotic and desperate. The meeting concluded, and James was finally free to leave. He stopped by his locker to collect his things and found several messages on his phone. His mother worried after seeing the news. His brother, congratulating him. His ex-girlfriend, oddly enough, saying she'd always known he'd do something extraordinary. He responded to his mother, assuring her he was fine, then turned off his phone. He couldn't deal with the rest right now. The locker room was empty, which James was grateful for. He sat on the bench, still in his torn jacket, and let himself feel everything he'd been holding back all day. The fear, the relief, the strange guilt that came with being called a hero when he'd only done what seemed necessary. His hands started shaking again, and this time he let them. James woke the next morning to the sound of his phone buzzing incessantly on the nightstand. He'd finally turned it back on before bed, and now he was regretting that decision. Bleary-eyed, he reached for it and saw dozens of notifications. Missed calls, text messages, emails, social media alerts. The screen was a sea of red notification badges. He sat up slowly, his ribs protesting the movement. The bruising had set in overnight, and his entire left side felt like it had been hit with a hammer. His shoulder was stiff, and his elbow throbbed where the skin had scraped away. Small prices to pay, he reminded himself. The first message he read was from Deputy Commander Walsh, sent at 6 in the morning. It was brief and direct. James was to report to headquarters at 10 for a meeting with the Director of Royal Protection. Formal dress uniform required. James felt his stomach tighten. A meeting with the director could mean many things, none of which he could control. He'd done what he thought was right, what his training had prepared him for, but the inquiry was just beginning, and he had no idea how it would unfold. He forced himself out of bed and into the shower, letting hot water work on his stiff muscles. As he stood under the spray, fragments of dreams came back to him. He'd been running all night in his sleep, trying to reach someone who was always just out of reach. The car kept coming, over and over, and sometimes he made it in time. Sometimes he'd end. After dressing in his formal uniform, James made the mistake of checking the news on his tablet. The incident was everywhere. Every major outlet had covered it. The headlines varied in tone, but the story was the same. Guard saves Princess Anne from speeding car. Royal Protection Officer acts heroically. Split-second decision prevents tragedy. There were videos from multiple angles, pieced together by news organizations into dramatic compilations. James watched one, seeing himself from an outside perspective for the first time. The sudden lunge, the protective wrap of his arms, the way they'd tumbled together away from the curb, the car's mirror clipping a shoe. It all looked more dramatic on screen than it had felt in the moment. The comments sections were filled with praise, though James tried not to read too many. People calling him a hero, demanding he receive medals and commendations. A few conspiracy theorists claiming it was staged. Some criticizing the driver, calling for his arrest and prosecution. Others defending him as a victim of distracted driving culture. James closed the browser. He didn't want to see anymore. The public's opinion didn't matter. What mattered was the assessment of his superiors and, more importantly, whether Princess Anne was truly safe and well. He arrived at headquarters 40 minutes early and spent the time in the gym, working through his anxiety with a punishing workout despite his sore muscles. By the time 10 o'clock arrived, he felt more centered, more ready for whatever was coming. Director Elizabeth Chin's office was on the top floor, a space that balanced authority with warmth. She was a woman in her late 50s who had risen through the ranks of royal protection through a combination of sharp intelligence, unflappable calm, and genuine dedication to her role. She'd been in charge for 8 years, The unit had become more professional and efficient under her leadership. James stood at attention as he entered. Director Chen gestured for him to sit. She studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she smiled, and James felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. She told him to relax. This wasn't an interrogation. She wanted to talk to him as a person, not just as an officer under review. She asked him how he was feeling, physically and mentally. James gave her an honest assessment. Sore but functional. Shaken but managing. He'd slept poorly, but that was to be expected. Director Chen nodded. She'd read his report and watched the videos. She'd also spoken with Commander Phillips and reviewed the witness statements. Based on everything she'd seen and heard, James's actions were exemplary. He'd identified a threat, made an accurate assessment in microseconds, and acted decisively to protect his principal. That was exactly what Royal Protection officers were trained to do. James felt relief wash over him. But Director Chen wasn't finished. She leaned forward slightly, her expression becoming more serious. She explained that while his actions were justified and praiseworthy, there would still be a formal inquiry. It was required by protocol any time an officer made physical contact with a royal family member, regardless of circumstances. The inquiry would be thorough but fair. James had nothing to worry about as long as he continued to be honest and complete in his testimony. She also warned him that the media attention would intensify before it died down. He would likely be approached by reporters, offered money for interviews, pressured to share his story. Director Chen's advice was simple. Say nothing. Refer all media requests to the palace press office. Let them manage the narrative, James agreed readily. He had no desire to be in the spotlight. He just wanted to do his job. Director Chen stood, and James rose with her. She extended her hand, and they shook firmly. She told him the palace was grateful for his service. Princess Anne had personally asked that her thanks be conveyed. James would be returning to active duty immediately, though he'd be assigned to different rotation for the next few weeks while the inquiry proceeded. As James turned to leave, Director Chen called his name. He looked back, and she was smiling again. She told him that, in her 25 years in royal protection, she'd seen many brave acts. But what he did yesterday would be talked about for years to come. He'd set a new standard. James left her office feeling strange. Proud, yes, but also somehow diminished. He didn't want to be the standard. He just wanted to be a good officer. The rest of the day passed in a blur of administrative tasks. He filed additional reports, attended a session with the unit psychologist, which was mandatory after any traumatic incident, and caught up with colleagues who wanted to congratulate him or hear the story firsthand. By late afternoon, James was exhausted and ready to go home. But as he was leaving, Sarah caught up with him in the parking garage. She looked excited, which was unusual for her normally calm demeanor. She told him there was news from the palace. Princess Anne wanted to meet with him privately tomorrow. Not a formal debriefing or official business. A personal thank you. James felt his pulse quicken. A private audience with a member of the royal family was rare, especially outside of official functions. He asked Sarah if this was normal. She shook her head. Normal would be a letter of commendation, or maybe a brief handshake at some formal event. A private meeting meant Princess Anne felt a personal connection to what had happened. She wanted to express her gratitude in her own way. That night, James barely slept again. He kept thinking about the upcoming meeting, wondering what to say, how to act. He'd been trained in royal protocol, of course. How to address members of the royal family, how to stand, when to speak. But this felt different, more personal. More real? The next morning, he dressed in his regular uniform and drove to Windsor Castle, where Princess Anne was in residence. He was met at the staff entrance by Victoria Hartley, the private secretary, who escorted him through a maze of corridors to a small sitting room. Overlooking the gardens, Princess Anne was already there, dressed casually in a sweater and trousers, looking more relaxed than he'd ever seen her. She stood when he entered, and Victoria quietly excused herself, closing the door behind her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Princess Anne gestured to a chair and asked him to please sit. She sat across from him, and James noticed she moved a bit stiffly. The bruise on her hip must still be bothering her, She started by asking how he was recovering. James gave a brief update, downplaying his injuries. She listened carefully, then admitted she wasn't sleeping well either. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that car coming toward her. She heard the engine, felt the impact of James hitting her, driving her to safety. James nodded. He understood. He'd been reliving it too. Princess Anne leaned back slightly and told him she wanted to thank him properly, away from officials and protocols and cameras. What he'd done had saved her life. There was no question about that. The investigators had calculated the car's speed and trajectory. If he hadn't acted, if he had hesitated even half a second longer, she would have been hit directly. The impact would likely have been fatal. Hearing it stated so plainly made James's throat tight. He'd known, of course, but having it confirmed was different. The princess continued. She said she'd lived her entire life with security around her. She'd always understood intellectually that these men and women were willing to die to protect her. But she'd never truly grasped what that meant until the moment James threw himself between her and that car. The willingness to sacrifice oneself for another person, even royalty, was profound. It was the highest form of service. James found his voice and told her quietly that she was worth protecting. Not because of her title, but because of who she was. The work she did, the people she helped. He'd watched her over the years he'd been assigned to her detail. She showed up. She did the hard work. She cared. That mattered. Princess Anne looked surprised, then touched. She was quiet for a moment before speaking again. She said that most people saw the crown, the title, the position. Very few saw the person beneath. She appreciated that he did. They talked for nearly an hour. The conversation ranging from the incident to their respective careers to the challenges of public service. James found himself relaxing, talking to her not as a royal, but as a person. She was funny, he discovered, with a dry wit that caught him off guard. She was also deeply thoughtful about her role and the responsibilities that came with it. Eventually, Victoria knocked softly and entered, reminding the princess of her next appointment. Princess Anne rose, and James stood as well. She walked him to the door, then paused. She told him that she'd been thinking about what she could do to properly acknowledge what he'd done. She'd spoken with the palace, and they agreed he should receive the Royal Victorian Medal for his actions. It was one of the highest honors for personal service to the monarchy. James felt overwhelmed. He tried to protest, saying he'd only done his job, but Princess Anne raised a hand gently. She said it was decided. The ceremony would be private, just family and a few officials. She hoped he would accept with grace. What could he say to that? He nodded his acceptance, and she smiled. Then she did something completely unexpected. She hugged him. It was brief and proper, but it was genuine. When she stepped back, her eyes were bright with emotion. She told him to take care of himself, and he promised he would. Then Victoria was leading him back through the corridors, and he was outside in the sunshine, trying to process everything that had just happened. The weeks that followed were strange. The inquiry concluded quickly, finding James's actions not just justified, but exemplary. The formal report praised his situational awareness, quick thinking, and physical courage. It became a case study that would be taught to future royal protection officers. The media eventually moved on to other stories, though James's name would forever be associated with that day. He received letters from around the world, people thanking him, praising him, sharing their own stories of close calls and near misses. He tried to read them all, though it became overwhelming. The driver of the car, a young man named Marcus Webb, was charged with dangerous driving and sentenced to community service and a suspended license. James attended one session of the trial, sitting in the back of the courtroom. Marcus looked devastated, broken by what he'd almost done. When their eyes met, James saw, not a villain, but a scared kid who'd made a terrible mistake. There was no satisfaction in his punishment, only sadness for all involved. The ceremony for the Royal Victorian Medal took place on a cool morning in October. 7 months after the incident, James's family attended, his mother crying proud tears, his father standing tall and beaming. Sarah was there, along with Director Chen and many of his colleagues from the Royal Protection Unit. Princess Anne presented the medal herself, pinning it to James's uniform with steady hands. The citation read aloud spoke of courage, dedication, and selfless service. James stood at attention, feeling the weight of the medal and all it represented. After the ceremony, there was a small reception. James's mother hugged him so tightly he could barely breathe. His father shook his hand and told him he'd always known James was destined for something special. His brother clapped him on the back and joked that James had set an impossibly high bar for the rest of the family. But the moment that mattered most came later. When the crowds had thinned and James found himself standing alone on a terrace, looking out over the palace gardens, Princess Anne joined him. Standing beside him in comfortable silence for a moment, she told him she'd been thinking a lot about that day. About fate and timing and the thread of choices that led to any given moment. If he'd looked away for even a second, if she'd delayed leaving the meeting by a minute, if the driver had checked his phone at any other time, so many variables had to align perfectly for disaster, and just as many had to align for salvation. James agreed. He'd thought about it too. All the what-ifs that haunted him in quiet moments. Princess Anne turned to look at him directly. She said she didn't believe in fate exactly, but she believed in purpose. And she thought perhaps they'd both been exactly where they needed to be that day. Him with his training and awareness and willingness to act. Her with the work she was doing, the people she was trying to help. Maybe the universe had a way of protecting important work when it could. James wasn't sure about that, but he liked the idea. It made the randomness of it all feel less terrifying. She asked him what his plans were. Would he stay in royal protection? He'd certainly earned his place. James had been thinking about this. He told her honestly that he wasn't sure. Part of him wanted to continue, to keep doing the work he'd trained for. But another part wondered if he'd already had his moment, his one chance to make a real difference. Could anything else compare? Princess Anne smiled at that. She told him that heroism wasn't always dramatic. Most of the time, it was quiet and persistent. It was showing up day after day, doing the right thing, even when no one was watching. Protecting and serving without expectation of recognition. He'd proven he could do the dramatic kind. The question was whether he had the strength for the quiet kind, which in many ways was harder. Those words stayed with James long after the ceremony ended. He thought about them as he returned to duty, assigned once again to Princess Anne's protection detail. He thought about them during long, uneventful days standing post while she attended meetings and charity events. He thought about them during the nights when he still occasionally dreamed of that car coming down the street. Over time, the dreams faded. The sore muscles healed completely. His torn jacket was repaired and returned to service. The scrape on his elbow left a small scar, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. Life returned to something like normal, though James was never quite the same person he'd been before. He stayed in royal protection, ultimately deciding that Princess Anne had been right. The quiet heroism of daily service was its own kind of courage. There was honor in being present, in staying alert, being ready to act if needed, even if that moment never came again. 3 years later, James was promoted to Senior Protection Officer. 5 years after that, he was leading the training program, teaching new recruits the skills and mindset needed for the work. He told them all the technical details, the protocols and procedures and tactical responses. But he also told them about that March morning, about the car and the princess and the split-second decision that changed everything. He told them that training was essential, that knowledge and preparation mattered enormously. But in the end, it came down to something simpler: the willingness to move toward danger instead of away from it. The willingness to put someone else's safety above your own. That couldn't really be taught. It had to come from within. Some of the recruits understood. Others would learn in time, or they wouldn't, and they'd find different careers. James could spot the ones who had it, though, the ones who would run toward danger when it mattered. They had a certain quality in their eyes, a quiet determination that reminded him of himself in that moment on Baker Street. Princess Anne continued her work, tireless as ever. She and James maintained a professional relationship, but there was an unspoken understanding between them. A bond forged in crisis that didn't need words or regular contact to remain strong. Occasionally at official functions, Their eyes would meet across a crowded room, and they'd exchange a small nod, remembering, acknowledging. On the 10th anniversary of the incident, a reporter tracked James down and asked him to reflect on that day. James, older now and more comfortable with his place in the story, agreed to a brief statement. He said that he thought about it sometimes, of course. How could he not? But mostly, he thought about what came after. The work Princess Anne had continued to do. The thousands of people she'd helped through her tireless advocacy for healthcare, rural communities, and charitable causes. The lives touched by her service in the years since that day, his action had taken seconds. Her work had continued for years. When he thought about it that way, his part seemed very small, but he was glad he'd been there, glad he'd been ready, glad he'd moved when it mattered. The reporter asked if he considered himself a hero. James was quiet for a long moment before answering. He said, "No, not really. A hero was someone who sought out danger, who went looking for chances to prove themselves. He'd just been doing his job. He'd just been in the right place at the right time with the right training." But, he added, if his story inspired other people to act when action was needed, to protect those who needed protecting, to move toward danger instead of away from it, then maybe something good had come from it all. Maybe that was enough. Reporter thanked him and left, and James returned to his work. There were new recruits to train, protocols to update, security assessments to review. The unglamorous, necessary work of protection that happened every day, unseen and unacknowledged by most of the world. That evening, as he walked to his car, James's phone buzzed with a message. It was from Princess Anne's private secretary, passed along from the princess herself. Just a few words, but they meant everything. The message read simply, "Still grateful. Still inspired by your example. The work continues." James smiled and slipped the phone back into his pocket. The work continues. That was all any of them could hope for. To do the work, to show up, to be ready when needed, to protect and serve with honor and dedication, whether the cameras were watching or not. He got in his car and drove home through London's evening traffic, past Baker Street, where a small plaque now marked the spot where something extraordinary had happened. Most people walked past it without noticing. That was fine. Now, the quiet work of making the world safer happened mostly in moments no one saw, in decisions no one celebrated, in the daily choice to be present and vigilant and ready. That lesson on a March morning when time slowed down and everything hung in the balance, he'd carry it with him for the rest of his life, and he'd pass it on to everyone he trained. Not for glory or recognition, but because it was right. Because some things were worth protecting. Because when the moment came, someone had to be ready to move. And he had been. It would always be enough.